Vino Geek Podcast, wine from a Kiwi perspective. Welcome back to the Vino Geek Podcast. This week we're touching on a couple of week or so. These things have come up, and I figured that if these been asked, then or being talked about, then why shouldn't I do an episode on them? Because they're obviously relevant and poignant at the time. The first one, they sort of link in together. We had there was a visit from a wine company, and they're going to go through a rebranding, sort of new labeling, and it's interesting because of how they've decided to go about it, and that's what around what kind of label is the best label to use versus this type of labeling and branding best for the market. And the other one was one of the staff, same wine company, said, "Oh, the wines that were here are a bit boring. There wasn't anything different or unique or just out of the box. It was just all pretty stock standard." And so that got me thinking, about wine trends. What this guy's he's 30, so what styles of wine are appealing to a younger generation, and is there a need for some of the older traditional producers to change things up a bit, to try new things, or is that just left to the domain of the younger wine companies? As well as branding and who is it appealing to? All this. So, just taking a quick pause in the episode to remind you to like, subscribe, comment, and come and follow me on socials too. Yes, so as I said, over the past week, there's been these two sort of topics come up and revolved around the one particular wine producer. Actually, something to note: if you're noticing a change in the picture this week and how my phone packed up on me, so I'm in the process of sorting that out. So, which is what I do all my recording on. So this week I'm recording on the iPad. So I've had to be a little bit skewed because obviously the camera's to one side of the screen, and so it's a little bit different, if you like. But anyway, that being said, let's get into it. So the first one there's a company that's been going for a fair while now, sort of 40 years, and they're rebranding. And the thing I noticed with it was that I was just like, oh, it's just, first impression was, oh, it's still a little bit boring. After almost 12 years in retail, packaging makes a big difference with wine labels and wines, and how they appeal to people and what's going on. I mean, obviously, the traditional label is very much focused on, I would say, the educated wine consumer, the people that aren't wowed by packaging or labels. They're just looking for the content in the bottle and wanting the label to show what the content is. And that could be quality, it could be the brand, it could be the variety, the vintage, the region, tick, 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 tick. That's what they want to see. And traditional labeling really does cover that, especially New Zealand traditional labeling. But they're boring, and they tend to look the same as everything else on the shelf. If you go into a retail store and look at the Kiwi wine selection, 95% of the wines are either white, black, or grey. Very monochrome, very boring, very uniform. It's almost like they've all gone to the same company to design their labeling, and so it all looks the same. And how do you stand out in a market so saturated already if you aren't going for a label that's a little bit left of centre? Sure, you might scare away some of those more traditionalists and traditional buyers, but how do you stand out? For me, that's the key, is understanding whether you're wanting to stand out from the crowd or just blend in. And yeah, I assume for most, they don't want to blend in, but that's what they're doing. They might look great when you put the lineup together and it's all the same wine and all from the one wine company. It looks great. But when you stick it on a shelf with 50 million other labels that look the same, it doesn't look so great. It just gets lost. So my thing is, why? Why do they do this? Why do they stick with the same boring label? If you're not an established brand that just people buy it because of the brand, likes of a Tomato or Cloudy Bay or what have you. Even Cloudy Bay freshened up their label a few years ago, but it's still the same sort of basic bland label. What makes you stand out from the rest? If you're not one of those companies, sure, you might be aspiring to be one of those companies, but if you haven't got those decades of rusted on fans, you can't get there. And even still, those producers that have been going for decades don't have the rusted on fans like the rest of these companies do. So what are they doing? They're not appealing to people the way they need to. And that's, and that's the thing, like, and the other one was with this particular brand, they had got rid of they're getting rid of their second label, and they're having they're having 3 tiers, all with the same color scheme and only one word different, which I said straight away, alarm bells, that's going to cause confusion because people aren't going to know what they're buying, and somebody's going to say, oh yeah, I had this blah 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 wine, and their friends go and buy it and they buy the wrong one, and it's not right. It's not as good as their reserve, which their friends had, because they can't identify it easily. These producers think that it's better for everybody to go, oh yeah, it's all their same brand, when people can see that with a subtle tweak in colouring. It doesn't have to be all monochrome one colour with just the one name, because there's confusion. And that's not just confusion with the customers, it's also with the staff. I know for years, producers that had the exact same label, but they had a reserve or an estate or what have you. If they were the exact same label and it was just that name different, confusion happened with the staff. The staff had no idea that there was these different tiers of wine. So why are they assuming that the customers know what they're talking about? That the customers are going to get it. All it has to be is a change in color. They can keep the same labeling, they can keep it, but change the color. Change the color scheme slightly in some way, because that will identify to people, oh, yes, they said it was this producer, let's say Tomato for example, because, we use them, well, they said it was a Tomato Syrah, but this doesn't taste anywhere near as good as the one we had, hence the bullnose. Where if they had a different color, like say the bullnose was gold and the estate was white, then they go, oh no, that was the wrong color. It wasn't that color, it was gold. So they know to buy the bullnose instead of the estate, which is slightly different, because with Tomato, and it goes without saying, they literally, consumers call it Tomato bullnose. They don't necessarily call it Syrah, they call it Tomato bullnose. Tomato has done a great thing in how they've marketed their different wines, because people refer to them by those names. So the Awatere and the Coleraine, it's not Tomato Cabernet. They don't call it Tomato Cabernet. They call it the Coleraine. They call it the Awatere. The Reserve Chardonnay is the Elston. They call it the Elston. So they don't have that same issue, because traditional label rusted on fans for decades, producing super high quality. So they don't have this confusion level. where these other producers can and will have and do have these levels of confusion. That people think they're buying the right wine. I mean, as an example, a family member of mine went to a restaurant and had the Escarpment Coupe and absolutely loved it. Thought this was the best, ever. And I told them this is how much it costs because I was at the merchant at the time. This is how much it costs. And then they said, oh, it was on special online. And I brought it and it was $40 odd. And I said, that was the estate. That wasn't Escarpment's Coupe. And I said, no, 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 it was. And then the wine arrived and they realized they brought the wrong wine. Confusion because the labeling is the same. The only thing different is the coupe is on there, And so this is what I'm talking about. Color differentiation makes a huge difference, or just the picture variants, likes of, Mount Difficulty, for instance. Mount Difficulty, and that Roaring Meg is very different from the Mount Difficulty. And then even the single vineyard is very different, but that's because of color. They use gold to showcase that. So this is where we're coming from, is that if you don't have a real distinction between your tiers of wine, people aren't going to know what you're talking about. And so, I implore producers out there to be mindful of that and have your wine stand out. Don't let them blend in. Be bold, be avant-garde. One of my favorite producers, and those of you who have followed me since the start know how much I love Lime Rock. The issue I have with Lime Rock is their wines don't stand out. It's a very basic, plain labeling. They did a one-off with it, but I thought they should embrace the lime aspect of their name, Full Noise, and put lime on their labels. It doesn't have to be the whole label, just be certain accents on the label be lime green, so that people knew when they saw the lime green, it was Lime Rock, and they'll pick it up and go, oh, why is this? For good or for bad, it will stand out. And that's what you need. You need, especially in a retail environment, you need people to pick up your wine labels, the wines. You need to attract people. And this is the thing. You out there, the consumers that think that, oh no, I won't touch that wine because of the packaging. Pick it up and have a look at it. Because quite often, the smart producers are doing it so that you will pick up the wine. It will garner interest. Otherwise, people just won't see it. If you see 10 wines that look all the same, you're going to pick the one that you know. You're not going to pick the strange random one. But if the strange random one has a different label, you're going to pick it. And so that's what I'm talking about, is that you need to drive just that interest. You need people to engage with your product. And if they don't, then you're losing sales because they're just going to engage with something else. And this is where we're coming to this, especially, in a time when people are drinking less. You need to stand out. And consumers, don't be fooled by the packaging. Some are trying to be these fancy places. That's why they're using bland, lifeless labels. Others are trying to use these more risque labels to get you to buy the wine, to try their wine, because their wine is really good and they want you to see it. They don't want you to just brush over it. So, yeah. And then the next one was wine styles, and this tied in with the same company, a traditional Kiwi producer producing the same Kiwi wines, which nothing wrong with them, and they execute them well, but where's the interest? Where's the intrigue? Where is pulling in new people that are curious? You're not pulling in these new people. All you're doing is just trying to hold on to your same rusted on people, which all good and well, but you still need to be driving new sales and you need to be sucking in new people. So you need to make your wine more interesting. And it could be by the labeling, and quite a bit of it is by the labeling, but also the styles of wine you're using, the newer varieties that are out there. Gone are the days when you only had five great wine styles to choose from. There's so many out there. There's, all these new varieties. There's Albarino, Viognier is not new, but it's relatively new to the customer, white blends, red blends, chilled reds, the lighter style reds. Why are these traditional producers not doing that? Sure, you could be like Te Mata and sell out virtually every year, so it doesn't matter. They can keep doing what they're doing and it's all good. But if you're in the middle between the avant-garde, small production, doing things a little bit differently and just making ultra small production and just selling it all, versus producer that's rusted on decades, just doing the same things year in, year out because that works. And you're in this middle, and trust me, there is bucket loads of people out there. They need to be diversifying because younger drinkers and curious drinkers want to drink different things. They don't just want to drink the same things. I myself don't want to drink the same things all the time. I don't want to just have your stock standard. You can use the stock standard style of varieties and make different wine. It's perfectly fine. You need to be doing these things. You need to be just allowing yourself to try these things, because if you don't know, you don't know, and as my son says, you don't know what you don't know. So infuriating, but it makes sense. Test the market. There's some curiosity out there. Test it out. And the fact that there's you and 50 million other brands clamoring for the small percentage of the market that wine holds, you need to be doing this. You need to be diversifying. You need to be trying new things because you need to attract new drinkers. You can't rely on the same people that are just getting older and older and older. You need to be spreading, diversifying things. If you're a Pinot producer, produce a Pinot Noir that's very light, very fresh, very chillable, as well as your more traditional style. Produce a white Pinot. They're very trendy. Produce a white blend. They're becoming more and more popular. At Lionel's have a few, and people enjoy them. Because they're a little bit different. They have a bit for everybody. It's not just one type of thing. It's different things. So just be aware, and consumers. When these producers go out on a limb and do these different things, try them. Try the chilled reds. Sure, I've banged on the drum about how this has been done for decades in Europe, and it's not called chilled reds. They just make a style of red that can be chilled and is very nice chilled. So, you can argue the point about that, but just, try these wines. They're going out of their way to do this for you, to create interest for you, not only themselves, but for you. Give you something different to try. Have it with the different foods that are now available. All of these things, they're doing it for you too. So give it a try, Don't be pigeonholed into, I only drink Pinot Gris. Try different things, and I encourage people all but every week to try different things. With all the different foods that are now available, that restaurants are serving, they're looking to push the envelope here and there and everywhere. The same traditional wines don't always work. You need to push it here and there. A client of mine that I deal with locally, Indian restaurant, I suggested they put on a Moscato style Sauvignon Blanc on their list because, sweeter wines, lower acid wines go really well with Indian cuisine. So try this because it is Sauvignon Blanc, so it's not too scary, it's not too strange, but it's in a style that's going to be to fit the food. So things like that, don't be afraid because there is some great things out there that are just waiting for you to try them. So yeah, little bit shorter episode, this one, and to be honest, more directed at wine companies, ironically. It wasn't necessarily meant for that, but yeah. But, encourage these wine producers to do different things, to try different things, to be a bit bolder, for you to create interest for yourselves, and try those wines that are a little bit different, whether it be the packaging, whether it be the style of wine. Give it a go. Just have some fun. And yeah, so after the break, we're going to actually try the wine of the week is actually something that's a little bit more traditional, but still really good.
Just taking a quick pause in the episode to remind you to like, subscribe, comment, and come and follow me on socials too.
Hey, yeah, the wine of the week, after all that ranting and raving, is the Ceres Composition Pinot Noir 2022. Just tried this recently and it was delicious. It wasn't the flashiest of brands. It wasn't a new style of anything. It was just a flat out good Pinot, but from a producer that's not very well known. I mean, Ceres isn't actually, like Ceres is the wine name, but the parent company is Dicey Wines. So the Dicey brothers, those of you out there might know the Dicey name from Mount Difficulty Wines, and the two brothers doing their own series of wines. Pardon the pun. Ceres is actually spelled like the Roman god Ceres rather than series. Anyway, and yeah, this is sort of like a second label for Dicey, and this is the 2022, which happened to be on special just the other day, so I picked it up. And just really well made, lighter style but well made. So the color was garnet with a light ruby core, so good color for a Pinot. On the nose, there's strawberries, cherries, the sort of blossom violet character, that really floral character, a little bit of kirsch and sort of creme de cassis, just that alcohol sort of fermented sort of berry character, a little bit of mushroom, touch of earthiness to it. So lovely complex nose. The palate was light and elegant, and with some light but bright acidity. So the acidity was fresh but not too heavy. Super fine tannins with that dusty cocoa sort of spice tones, and almost like a vermouth-like sort of character on the finish. Those sort of spices, those bitter spices, adding to that warmth and that depth that came at the finish. So really cool wine, but not super long finishing, and just purely simply Pinot and just easy drinking. Really good value, just smart wine and well worth finding out and drinking it. As far as food goes, charcuterie would be my first pick. Wines like lighter Pinots I think are amazing with charcuterie, mushroom risotto, or just some light meats. I picked this up for $22.99. I had a look online quickly and around the $29.99, so a little bit higher than expectation. But yeah, really good value. And yeah, thank you as always for listening, for joining me. Sante and Baruch Yahweh.